After aging out of foster care, I drove to a forgotten ranch. The letter in the barn made me sob. It turns out some inheritances aren't about money or land. They're about a truth so heavy it could either crush you or teach you how to stand up straight for the first time in your life. If you've ever felt like a piece of your own story was missing, stick around. You're in the right place. And if you feel a connection to what we talk about here, think about subscribing. These are the ones we have to dig up ourselves. My 18th birthday started the same way the 17 before it had, with a silence that felt louder than any celebration. In the sterile quiet of the Northgate group home, the date didn't mean cake or presents. It meant a deadline. It was a finish line nobody cheered you for crossing. For 2 years, this place had been my final stop in a long, winding tour of the state's foster care system. 2 years of beige walls, scheduled meals, and the practiced indifference of overworked staff. It wasn't a home. It was a holding cell with a checkout date. I packed my life into a single black duffel bag. A few changes of clothes, a worn paperback, a cracked photo of a woman I barely remembered, my mother. Everything I owned in the world fit into a space smaller than a pillow. The air in the administrative office was thick with the smell of cheap coffee and disinfectant. Mrs. Gable, my caseworker for the last 6 months, sat across from me at her metal desk. She had a kind face, etched with the sort of exhaustion you only see on people who fight losing battles for a living. She slid a thick manila envelope across the desk. It landed with a soft, final thud. "Leo," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "This is it. Everything the state has for you." Inside was my birth certificate, my social security card, and a final check for $250, the aging out stipend. Enough for a bus ticket to nowhere and a few meals, standard procedure. But beneath those papers there was something else, a smaller, heavier envelope. It was old, the paper yellowed at the edges. My name was written on the front in a shaky, unfamiliar script. "This came to our central office about a week ago," Mrs. Gable explained, watching my face carefully. "It was sent by a law firm in Montana. It was addressed to you to be delivered on your 18th birthday." My fingers felt numb as I opened it. Inside was a single, heavy, old-fashioned brass key, a folded, brittle document that looked like a property deed, and a letter on crisp, professional letterhead. The letter was from a lawyer named Alistair Finch. It stated, in cold legal terms, that I, Leo Vance, was the sole heir to the estate of my maternal grandfather, Thomas Vance. The estate consisted of a property known as the Black Creek Ranch, located just outside Jericho Springs, Montana. My grandfather had passed away 12 years ago. The property had been held in a trust, waiting for me to come of age. My breath caught in my throat. Grandfather. The name was a ghost, a whisper from the fog of early childhood. I had a single, faded memory of a tall man with rough hands and a sad smile. A man who smelled of sawdust and pine needles. After my mother died when I was 6, he had just vanished from my life. The system told me I had no living relatives. It was the first line in my file, the foundational fact of my lonely existence. All these years, I'd believed it. I'd built my identity around being an island, a person with no anchor to the past. "A ranch?" I whispered, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. "I don't understand." "Neither do we, fully," Mrs. Gable admitted. The file said no known kin. Clearly, the file was wrong. It happens. She said it with a shrug, a casual dismissal of a 12-year clerical error that had defined my entire life. "The lawyer, Mr. Finch, advises you to contact him immediately. He says there are time-sensitive matters to discuss regarding the property, back taxes, an outstanding offer to purchase. It sounds complicated, Leo." She looked at me, her professional mask slipping for just a moment, revealing a flicker of genuine concern. "You don't have to go. You could call the lawyer, have him sell it, and just take the money. It might be easier, starting fresh, you know." Easier. That's what the system always wanted. The path of least resistance. Don't ask questions, don't dig up the past. Just sign the papers and disappear quietly. For a second, I considered it. Take the money and run. Find a cheap apartment in some anonymous city and try to build a life. It was the sensible option. But as I stared at the brass key in my palm, something shifted in me. It was heavy, real. It was a link to a past I'd been told didn't exist. It was the first mystery I'd ever been handed that was my own. The $250 from the state felt like a severance package. This key, this deed, it felt like a beginning. "I think I have to go," I said, my voice barely audible. "I think I need to see it." Mrs. Gable nodded slowly, a small sad smile playing on her lips. "I thought you might say that." She pushed a bus schedule across the desk. "The bus to Billings leaves at 7 p.m. From there, you can get a connection to Jericho Springs. It's a long ride, Leo." I looked down at the duffel bag at my feet, then back at the key in my hand. A long ride. My whole life had been a long ride to nowhere. For the first time, I had a destination. I didn't know if I was heading toward a home or a ruin, a truth or a lie. But for the first time, it felt like I was the one doing the driving. The silence of my birthday was finally broken by the sound of a choice being made. My choice. And in that sterile, beige office, that was a gift greater than any I could have imagined. The bus ride was a 3-day journey through the slow, bleeding heart of the country. I watched the world transform through the grimy window, a movie playing in reverse. The dense, vertical maze of the city unfolded into sprawling suburbs, which then dissolved into the flat, endless grid of Midwestern farmland. That, in turn, gave way to the rolling hills, and, finally, the vast, bruised sky of the West. With every mile, the knot of anxiety in my stomach tightened. I was trading the only world I knew, a world of concrete, crowds, and institutions, for something vast, empty, and unknown. The bus was a cocoon of recycled air and the low hum of tires on asphalt, a temporary limbo between the boy I had been and the man I was supposed to become. During the long hours, my mind drifted back. It sifted through the fractured memories of my childhood, trying to find him, my grandfather. I remembered a vague feeling of safety, the scratch of a wool jacket against my cheek, the low rumble of his voice reading a story I couldn't recall. These were just sensory ghosts, fragments without context. After my mom's car accident, the world had become a blur of strange houses, strange faces, and the constant, aching question, why was I alone? I was told my father had left long before, and my grandfather, well, he was just gone. No explanation, no goodbye. I learned early on that asking questions only led to sad looks and evasive answers. So I stopped asking. I accepted the official story. I was an orphan, a ward of the state, a ship without a harbor. Now, that story was cracking apart. Why would a man who abandoned me leave me his entire world? Why would he wait until I was 18? The precise moment I was at my most vulnerable, to drop this bombshell into my life. Was it a gift or a burden? A cruel joke or a desperate apology? The questions echoed in the space between the mile markers, each one unanswered. Jericho Springs wasn't so much a town as a pause in the highway. It was a single main street lined with brick buildings from a forgotten era, their facades weathered by a century of unforgiving winds. A gas station, a general store, a diner with a flickering neon sign, and a small tidy building with a polished brass plaque that read, Alistair Finch, Attorney at Law. Mr. Finch was as old and weathered as the town itself. He was a tall, skeletal man in a rumpled tweed suit that seemed a size too big for him. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his eyes sharp and intelligent behind thick glasses. His office smelled of old paper, leather, and pipe tobacco. It was a museum of a man's long, quiet life. He shook my hand, his grip surprisingly firm. "Leo Vance," he said, his voice a dry rustle. "You have your grandfather's eyes. I knew Thomas for 30 years. He was a good man, a complicated man." He gestured for me to sit, and for the next hour he laid out the situation in his calm, methodical way. The Black Creek Ranch was a significant piece of land, over 300 acres, but it had been sitting empty since Thomas's death. The house and barn were likely in disrepair. More urgently, the property taxes hadn't been paid for the last 3 years. The county was close to putting a lien on the property, which would lead to a forced auction. "Thomas set up the trust to transfer the deed to you on your 18th birthday," Finch explained, steepling his long fingers. His instructions were specific. He wanted you to have it free and clear, but his savings, which were meant to cover these expenses, ran out a few years ago. Then he got to the main point. "However, there is a silver lining. A development corporation, Mountain View Estates, has been trying to acquire land in this valley for a new resort project. They made an offer on your grandfather's property 2 years ago. They renewed that offer last week, as soon as the trust was set to expire. It's a generous offer, son. More than enough to cover the back taxes and leave you with a substantial sum. Enough to get a real start in life." He slid a piece of paper across his polished desk. A number was written on it, a number with so many zeros it looked like a misprint. It was more money than I could possibly comprehend. It was a ticket out. It was the easy answer Mrs. Gable had talked about. "Why do they want it so badly?" I asked, my voice sounding small in the quiet office. Finch leaned back, his chair groaning in protest. "Location, mostly. It has the only year-round creek in this part of the valley. Water rights are gold out here. Their plans include a golf course. They need the water from Black Creek." He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "My professional advice, Leo, is to take the offer. The ranch, it's a lot of work, a lot of heartache. Thomas loved that place, but it broke his heart, too. Selling it would give you freedom, a clean slate. Your grandfather, I believe, would have wanted you to be safe and secure." His words made perfect sense. Every rational part of my brain screamed at me to sign the paper, take the money, and never look back. It was the logical escape from a life defined by scarcity and instability. But my gaze kept falling on the brass key I'd placed on his desk. It wasn't just a key to a piece of land. It was a key to a story, my story. And I couldn't shake the feeling that selling it without ever setting foot on the property would be like tearing out the last page of a book I'd just begun to read. "Before I decide," I said, my heart pounding, "I need to see it. I need to go there." Alistair Finch studied me for a long moment. A flicker of something, surprise, maybe even respect, passed through his tired eyes. He nodded slowly. "I expected you would." Thomas was stubborn, too. He reached into a desk drawer and pulled out another key, this one attached to a simple, faded plastic tag. This was his. It's part of the estate. He dropped it into my hand. It was a car key. An old Ford pickup. It's been sitting in the garage behind my office for 12 years. I had my mechanic get it running last week just in case. The tank is full. The directions to the ranch are in the glove box. Walking out of that office, the weight of 2 keys in my pocket felt heavier than my entire duffel bag. One for a home I'd never seen, one for a truck I'd never driven. Mr. Finch's advice echoed in my ears. Sensible, logical, safe. But another voice, a quieter one from deep inside, whispered a different word: home. I didn't know what it meant, or if I'd find it at the end of that dirt road, but I knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that I had to find out. The old Ford truck was a beast of faded blue steel and rust, a relic from another time. The engine turned over with a reluctant, grinding cough before settling into a rough, rumbling idle. It felt alive beneath me, a sleeping giant reluctantly awakened. Following the hand-drawn map from the glove box, I drove out of Jericho Springs, leaving the small cluster of civilization behind. The paved highway soon gave way to a cracked asphalt road, which in turn surrendered to a wide, washboarded gravel lane. Dust billowed up behind me, a brown cloud marking my passage through the vast, empty landscape. The world out here was painted in broad, raw strokes of color. The deep blue of the endless sky, the pale gold of the dry grasses, the dark, brooding green of the distant pine-covered mountains. The scale of it was humbling. It made me feel incredibly small, a tiny, insignificant speck moving through a place that didn't know or care that I existed. In the city, you were always surrounded by people, by noise, by the constant pressure of humanity. Out here, the only presence was the wind, a steady, mournful sigh that swept across the plains. For the first time in my life, I was truly, completely alone. And it was both terrifying and strangely liberating. An hour later, the gravel road narrowed into a dirt track, little more than two ruts carved into the earth. The truck bounced and swayed, its old suspension groaning in protest. And then I saw it. A rusted metal gate, hanging crookedly from a single hinge, half swallowed by overgrown weeds. Nailed to a weathered wooden post was a faded, sun-bleached sign. I could just make out the carved letters: Black Creek Ranch. I killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. It rushed in to fill the space left by the truck's rumble, a profound, ancient quiet that seemed to emanate from the land itself. I got out and walked to the gate. The metal was cold and rough beneath my hand. This was the threshold. This was the place that had existed in secret, a hidden chapter of my life for 12 long years. Pushing the gate open took all my strength. It scraped against the hard-packed dirt with a sound like a tortured scream. I drove the truck through and parked, feeling like an intruder in a forgotten kingdom. The ranch was not what I had imagined. There were no white fences, no rolling green pastures. It was wild, neglected, and slowly being reclaimed by nature. The farmhouse stood on a slight rise, a 2-story wooden structure that had once been white, but was now a patchwork of gray, weathered boards and peeling paint. The porch sagged in the middle, like a tired old man slumping his shoulders. Windows were dark and vacant, like empty eyes. To its left stood a massive barn. Its red paint faded to a dull, rusty brown. Its roofline slightly bowed. The fields around them were choked with thigh-high weeds and wildflowers. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a memory that was trying its best to fade away. My heart sank. This was the reality. Not some romanticized inheritance, but a ruin, a burden. Mr. Finch was right. Selling it was the only sane option. This place wasn't a home. It was a ghost. And what was I going to do with a ghost? But I had come this far. I had to see it through. I walked up the creaking steps of the farmhouse porch. The brass key from the lawyer's envelope felt slick with sweat in my hand. I slid it into the lock. It was stiff, resistant. For a moment I thought it wouldn't work, that this final door would remain closed to me. Then, with a painful, grinding click, the lock turned. The door swung inward on a long, low groan. opening into darkness, and the thick, musty smell of trapped time. I spent the rest of that day just wandering. I moved through the silent, dust-choked rooms of the house like a phantom. Everything was covered in white sheets, turning the furniture into lumpy, anonymous shapes. I lifted a corner of one sheet in what must have been the living room, revealing a worn, plaid armchair. I could almost picture him sitting there, a tall man with sad eyes, reading a book in the fading light. In the kitchen, a ceramic coffee mug sat by the sink, as if waiting for a refill that would never come. Upstairs, I found two bedrooms. One was clearly his, with a simple wooden bed frame and a stack of books on the nightstand. Histories, biographies, books about farming. The other room was smaller. It was empty, except for a child-sized rocking horse in the corner, covered in a thick layer of dust. My room. It must have been my room. A wave of dizziness washed over me. I had lived here. I had a life here, a life that had been completely erased from my memory. I didn't stay in the house. The silence was too heavy, too full of questions I couldn't answer. I walked the land instead. I followed the line of leaning fence posts, my boots sinking into the soft earth. I found the creek that gave the ranch its name, a ribbon of clear, cold water cutting through a grove of cottonwood trees, their leaves shimmering silver in the breeze. The sound of the running water was the first truly peaceful sound I'd heard in days. I sat on its bank for hours, watching the water flow, feeling the sun on my face. This place was broken, yes. It was neglected and forgotten. But it was also beautiful. There was a strength in the land, a resilience in the way the wild grasses grew, a quiet dignity in the old, tired buildings. I felt a strange and powerful connection to it, a sense of belonging that I had never experienced before. It wasn't logical. It was a feeling that came from somewhere deeper, a whisper from the blood in my veins. This land knew me, even if I didn't know it. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, my eyes were drawn back to the barn. It was the largest structure on the property, a silent, hulking sentinel watching over the valley. It seemed to hold the ranch's deepest secrets. I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that if I was going to find any answers, they would be in there. The fear I'd felt earlier was still present, but now it was mixed with something else, a fierce, burning curiosity, a need to know. Taking a deep breath, I walked toward the massive, sliding doors, the setting sun casting my long shadow before me. The barn doors were heavy, solid things, built from thick planks of timber that had stood against a century of Montana winters. It took my entire body weight to slide one of them open, the rollers screaming in protest along the rusted track. The opening was just wide enough for me to slip through into the cavernous darkness inside. The air was cool and still, thick with the nostalgic scent of old hay, dry earth, and leather. High above, slivers of fading daylight pierced through gaps in the shingled roof, creating ethereal beams of light that illuminated swirling motes of dust, like stars in a dusty galaxy. The main space was vast and empty, save for the hulking, skeletal shape of an ancient tractor parked in the center, its tires long since flattened. To one side, empty stalls lined the wall, their wooden gates hanging open. It was a cathedral of silence and memory. I ran my hand along the rough-hewn wood of a support beam, feeling the splinters and the deep grain. How many seasons had this place seen? How many lives had it sheltered? I explored slowly, my footsteps echoing in the immense space. I found old tools hanging from pegs on the wall, their metal heads coated in a fine layer of rust, saws, hammers, pitchforks. Each one felt like a piece of a puzzle. These were the tools my grandfather had used. He had held them in his hands, the same hands I vaguely remembered as being so rough and strong. This was his work. This was his life. Tucked away in a back corner, almost hidden behind a stack of rotting hay bales, was a smaller door. It led to a cramped, windowless room. A tack room, I guessed. The air in here was even more still, the smell of leather stronger. Old bridles and saddles hung from hooks on the wall, their surfaces cracked and dry. And there, against the far wall, was a dark green metal footlocker. It was a military-style chest, solid and heavy, with a thick padlock on its clasp. My heart began to beat faster. It seemed too deliberate, too out of place. It was the only thing in the entire barn that was locked. I immediately thought of the keys in my pocket. The truck key was modern plastic. But the other one, the old brass key Mrs. Gable had given me, the one that hadn't fit the front door of the house, it looked like it belonged to another era, just like this footlocker. My fingers trembled as I pulled it from my pocket. I knelt in the dust, the cold of the concrete floor seeping through the knees of my jeans. I inserted the key into the padlock. It slid in perfectly. With a deep breath, I turned it. There was a loud, satisfying click that echoed in the small, quiet room. The lock sprang open. I lifted the heavy lid of the chest. My mind raced with possibilities. Money? Valuables? Something that would explain the developer's intense interest in this land? But the contents were far more personal and far more valuable. On top lay a thick, leather-bound journal. Beneath it was a stack of photo albums, and under those was a bundle of letters, at least 24 of them, tied together with a piece of simple twine. On the very top of the bundle was a single, sealed envelope. In the same shaky, elegant script I'd seen before, it was addressed to me. It read, "For Leo, to be opened on your 18th birthday." This was it. The reason I was here. The answer to a question I hadn't even known how to ask. I sat down on the dusty floor, my back against the cold wall of the tack room. The last rays of sunlight were fading from the barn, and the shadows were growing long. I carefully broke the seal on the envelope and unfolded the pages within. The letter began, "My dearest Leo, if you are reading this, then I am long gone, and you are finally a man. There is so much I have to tell you, so much I need to explain. I know you must hate me. I know you must believe I abandoned you, and I cannot blame you. But I need you to know that not a day has gone by in all these years that I haven't thought of you. Not a day has gone by that I haven't loved you." Tears welled in my eyes, hot and sudden. I had to stop and wipe them away with the back of my hand, my vision blurring the words on the page. I had spent my entire life believing I was unloved, a piece of driftwood on the ocean of the world. And here, in a dusty barn on a forgotten ranch, was a voice from the grave telling me I was wrong. I took another shaky breath and continued to read. The story that unfolded on those pages was not the one I had been told. It was a story of love, of sacrifice, and of a danger I had never known existed. And as I read, the entire foundation of my life began to crumble, only to be rebuilt, line by painful line, into a truth that was both heartbreaking and beautiful. I sat there in the gathering dark and I read, and for the first time, I sobbed. I cried for the boy who had grown up alone, and I cried for the old man who had died alone to make sure that boy would one day be safe. If you've ever felt completely alone, like a story you were told about your life was missing a crucial chapter, then you know exactly how I felt in that moment. The weight of that letter in my hands was the weight of a life I'd never known, a history I'd been denied. What I read next didn't just change my plans for the future. It reached back in time and rewrote my entire past. It's a strange feeling. to have the ground beneath your feet turn out to be something other than what you thought. If that feeling resonates with you, I hope you'll consider subscribing and becoming part of this community. We're all just trying to piece our own stories together. Now, let's get back to the letter. My grandfather's words painted a picture of a life I could barely imagine. He wrote about my mother, his daughter, not as the faded photograph in my wallet, but as a vibrant, laughing young woman who loved this land as much as he did. He wrote about her marriage to my father, a charming man who, it turned out, had a dark side. My father was a gambler, always chasing the next big score, always one step ahead of his debts. After I was born, it got worse. He started borrowing money from dangerous people, men who didn't care about excuses, only about repayment. The letter explained that my father had used the Black Creek Ranch, my mother's inheritance, as collateral for one of his biggest debts. He forged my grandfather's signature. When my mother found out, she was devastated. She confronted him, threatened to leave him and take me. That was the night she died. The official report called it a single-car accident on a rain-slicked road. My grandfather never believed it. He wrote, "I will carry to my grave the belief that they ran her off the road, Leo. A warning to me and your father. A way of showing us they were serious." After her death, my father fell apart completely. The creditors came calling. They didn't just want money, they wanted the ranch. They saw its potential, the water rights, the location. It was worth far more than the debt. My grandfather, Thomas, spent every cent he had on lawyers, fighting them in court. He managed to prove the forgery and get the title back in his name, but it cost him everything. And it made him enemies. He wrote, "These were not men who respected the law, Leo. They were predators. I knew they wouldn't just give up. And I knew they saw you as their next point of leverage. As long as you were here, as long as you were known as my grandson, you were a target. If anything happened to me, they would have found a way to get control of you, and through you, this land. I couldn't let that happen, so I made the hardest decision of my life." He had arranged it all. He worked with a contact deep inside the social services system to have me placed into foster care under a slightly altered name, my file scrubbed of any mention of him. He became a ghost, legally and personally. He had to make the world believe I was completely alone, that I had no one, so that no one would ever come looking for me. It was a desperate, agonizing act of protection, disguised as the ultimate act of abandonment. To let you go was like cutting out my own heart, he wrote, the ink slightly smeared in this section, as if by a tear. I watched from a distance when I could. I got reports. I knew you were safe, but I knew you were alone. I hope one day you can understand that I chose your safety over my own happiness. This ranch, this land, it was your mother's legacy, and it is now my legacy to you. I have spent the last years of my life making it a fortress for you." The journal that was also in the footlocker was the proof. It was a meticulous record of his lonely war. It detailed every threat, every suspicious car that drove by, every legal maneuver. He had documented the names of the men my father was indebted to, and he had traced their connections to a larger criminal organization that used real estate development as a way to launder money. He had uncovered the truth about Mountain View Estates. They weren't just a generic developer. They were the same people, operating under a legitimate corporate facade, patiently waiting for the day the ranch would legally become mine. They assumed I'd be a desperate kid, ignorant of the property's true value in history, an easy mark who would jump at the first lowball offer. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. Every ounce of anger and resentment I had ever felt toward my grandfather for abandoning me evaporated, replaced by a profound, gut-wrenching understanding. He hadn't left me. He had hidden me. He had spent the last decade of his life as a solitary guardian, a lonely watchman on the walls of this ranch, protecting a future for a grandson he couldn't even speak to. The neglect of the property wasn't a sign of apathy. It was part of his strategy. He let it look worthless, abandoned, so no one would look too closely. My entire life, the story I had told myself was a lie. But it was a lie designed to keep me alive. The system hadn't failed to find my family. My family had used the system to save me. The loneliness, the feeling of being disposable, the years of drifting. It had all been a shield. Mr. Finch's advice to sell, so logical and sensible just hours before, now sounded like a death sentence for my grandfather's memory. Taking that money wouldn't be a clean break. It would be the final, bitter victory for the very people he had fought against until his dying breath. I sat there in the dark, the cold of the barn seeping into my bones, the weight of 12 years of hidden love and silent battle settling onto my 18-year-old shoulders. The choice was never really about a piece of land. It was about a life's meaning. His, and now mine. The world had shrunk to the size of that small, dusty tack room. The only light was the pale blue glow of my phone's screen, illuminating the last of my grandfather's letters. After, the main one explaining everything, there were others. Shorter notes written over the years, one for my 8th birthday, one for my 10th, my 16th. They were unsent letters from a ghost, filled with the simple, heartbreaking things a grandfather would want to say. He wrote about how he imagined I was growing, what he hoped I was learning, how much of my mother he hoped I had in me. Each one was a fresh stab of grief and love. In the bottom of the footlocker, beneath the letters in the journal, was a false bottom. I found it by accident, my fingers tracing the metal edge. Prying it open, I found what was left of his savings. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a thick stack of cash, bound with rubber bands. A quick count revealed it was just over $5,000. Tucked in with the money was a small, handwritten note for the taxes, and to buy you some time to think. This is your fight now, Leo, if you choose to accept it, but you don't have to. Your safety is all that ever mattered. If walking away is the safest path, you take it, and you don't ever look back. I'll understand. That last line broke me all over again. Even in death, his only concern was for me. He was giving me an out. He was freeing me from any obligation to his memory, to his long, lonely war. I could take this money, add it to the developer's offer, and disappear. I could have a life of security, free from this dark, complicated history. For a moment, the temptation was immense. It was the siren song of easy, the promise of a life without this fight. I was just a kid. I had spent my life being moved around, following rules, staying quiet. Who was I to take on a shadowy corporation? Who was I to fight for a piece of land I hadn't even known existed yesterday? My phone buzzed, startling me in the profound silence. It was an unknown number, but the area code was local. I hesitated, then answered. "Leo, it's Alistair Finch." His voice was tinny, urgent. "I'm glad I reached you. I've just gotten off the phone with the representative from Mountain View Estates. They're getting impatient. They've authorized me to increase their offer, substantially." He named a new number, one that made the first offer seem small. It was life-changing money. It was never worry about anything again money. "They want an answer by morning, son," Finch pressed on. "This is a golden opportunity, a fresh start with a very comfortable cushion. You'd be a fool to pass it up. Just give me the word, and I can have the paperwork drawn up tonight." I looked around the dark tack room, at the ghostly saddles and the heavy, open footlocker. I could smell the dust and the leather and the old hay. I could feel the weight of my grandfather's journal in my lap. A fool to pass it up. Maybe he was right. From a practical standpoint, he absolutely was. But my grandfather hadn't been practical. He had been principled. He had been a guardian. He had traded everything, his peace, his money, his relationship with me, for a single, stubborn principle that this place, this legacy, would not be stolen. And in that moment a new feeling began to crystallize within me, pushing aside the fear and the doubt. It was a cold, hard anger. Anger at the men who had haunted my family for years. Anger at their patient, predatory circling. They thought I was just some dumb kid from the system. They thought I was weak. They thought I would roll over for a paycheck. They had underestimated my grandfather, and now they were underestimating me. My choice was clear. It wasn't even a choice, not really. It was an inheritance of a different kind. Not of land or money, but of responsibility. Of a fight that had been passed down to me. "Leo, are you there?" Mr. Finch's voice crackled through the phone. "I'm here," I said, and my own voice surprised me. It was steady, it was calm. It was a voice I hadn't heard myself use before. "Mr. Finch, thank you for the update, but you can call them back. Tell them the answer is no." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. "Son, are you sure you've thought this through? This is a life-altering amount of money." "I'm sure," I said, standing up and brushing the dust from my jeans. I looked out of the tack room door, into the vast dark space of the barn. It no longer felt like a ruin, it felt like an armory. I found some things here, in the barn, my grandfather's journals, letters. I think you need to see them. I think this is more complicated than just a real estate deal. I paused, taking a deep breath. The Black Creek Ranch is not for sale. I hung up the phone before he could argue further. The finality of my own words echoed in the silence. I had just turned down a fortune. I had just declared war on a powerful enemy I knew nothing about. I was 18 years old, alone, with a rundown ranch, a beat-up truck, and a box of old papers. I should have been terrified. But as I stood there in the barn my grandfather had built, under the roof he had sheltered, I felt something I hadn't felt in my entire life. I felt strong. I felt like I was finally, truly home. The next morning, I drove the old Ford back into Jericho Springs. The $5,000 was tucked safely in my duffel bag. When I walked into Alistair Finch's office, he looked at me as if I were a ghost. He had clearly spent the night convinced I'd lost my mind. I didn't say a word. I just walked over to his large mahogany desk and placed my grandfather's leather-bound journal on the polished surface. "Read it," I said. "Then we can talk." He looked from the journal to me, his brow furrowed in confusion. But he opened it. For the next 2 hours, the only sound in the office was the soft rustle of turning pages. I watched his expression change. It moved from professional curiosity to surprise, then to shock, and finally to a slow-burning, righteous anger. He was a small-town lawyer, a man of contracts and deeds, but he was also the man who had called my grandfather a friend. As he read about the threats, the intimidation, and the corporate shell game, I could see the lawyer in him connecting the dots my grandfather had so carefully laid out. When he finally closed the journal, he took off his glasses and rubbed his tired eyes. He looked at me, and for the first time, I felt like he truly saw me. Not as a troubled kid or a foolish heir, but as Thomas Vance's grandson. "My God," he whispered. "I knew Thomas was fighting something, but I had no idea. He never told me the details." He looked down at the journal. This is dynamite, Leo." He documented everything. Dates, names, license plate numbers. He was building a case. He was protecting me. I said quietly. And this ranch, he didn't want them to get it. Finch nodded, his mind clearly working, the gears of legal strategy beginning to turn. Their offer wasn't a business proposal, he said, his voice hard. It was the end of a very long, very patient siege. They've been waiting you out. He stood up and began to pace the small office. This changes everything. This isn't a real estate transaction anymore. It might even be a criminal matter. I pushed the stack of cash across the desk. This was hidden in the barn. It's for the back taxes. Can we pay them? Today? He looked at the money, then back at me, a glimmer of a smile on his face. We certainly can. First things first, let's secure the fort. That afternoon, we walked to the county clerk's office and paid the delinquent taxes in full. The clerk, a woman who'd probably held the position for decades, stamped the receipt with a satisfying thud. It felt like a victory, the first small battle won in a much larger war. With the property legally secure, the immediate threat of a tax auction was gone. The consequences of my decision came swiftly. The next day, the calls from Finch's office stopped. The pressure just vanished. But it was replaced by something more sinister. A sleek, black SUV with tinted windows started making slow passes by the ranch gate. It would drive by in the morning, and again in the evening, never stopping, just watching. It was a clear, silent message of intimidation. They were reminding me they were there. Instead of letting it scare me, I let it fuel me. I threw myself into the work of the ranch. The physical labor was a balm for my frayed nerves. It was grounding, real. Every task was a connection to my grandfather. When I patched the leak in the farmhouse roof, I was finishing a job he had likely started. When I pulled the weeds that choked the small vegetable garden near the house, I was reclaiming the land he had loved. I started small, mending a section of broken fence, clearing the overgrown path to the creek, scrubbing years of dust and grime from the farmhouse floors. Each repaired board, each cleared patch of earth, was an act of defiance. It was me, putting down roots. I started making trips into town for supplies. At the general store, an older woman with kind eyes and a cloud of white. That was Thomas Vance's old Ford, wasn't it? She asked. When I told her I was his grandson, her face broke into a warm smile. Well, I'll be. We all wondered what happened to him. He was a good man. Kept to himself in those last years, but always decent. At the local garage, a grizzled mechanic named Gus helped me figure out why the truck's engine was sputtering. He shared stories about my grandfather, too. Stubborn as a mule, that one, he said with a laugh, wiping grease from his hands. Got into a feud with the county over water rights once. Fought them for 2 years and won. Didn't back down for anybody. These small interactions were like finding missing pieces of a puzzle. The people of Jericho Springs remembered him. They respected him. I wasn't just some anonymous kid from the system anymore. I was Thomas Vance's grandson. I had a history here, a place. The subtle intimidation from the black SUV began to feel less threatening, and the quiet support of the community began to feel more real. I wasn't fighting this battle alone. I had the ghost of a stubborn old man and the memories of a small town on my side. And for the first time, that felt like more than enough. Weeks bled into a month, and the rhythm of the ranch became the rhythm of my life. I woke with the sun, the first light spilling over the eastern mountains and painting the valley in hues of soft pink and gold. My days were filled with the simple, satisfying ache of physical work. I learned the difference between the sounds the old house made, the groan of the pipes, the sigh of the wind under the eaves, the creak of the floorboards that meant the temperature was dropping. It was a language, and I was slowly becoming fluent. Mr. Finch, armed with the evidence from my grandfather's journal, had gone on the offensive. He was no longer just a small-town lawyer handling an estate. He had become a crusader. He filed a series of legal injunctions against Mountain View Estates, citing a history of harassment and predatory acquisition tactics. He sent copies of the journal's most damning pages to the state attorney general's office, flagging the corporation for investigation. The legal battle was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. But the dynamic had shifted. We were no longer on the defensive. We were taking the fight to them. The black SUV disappeared. The silent, watchful pressure was replaced by a tense, legal silence. One evening, I found myself back in the barn. The air was cool, and the scent of hay was sharp and sweet. I had started clearing it out, organizing the old tools, sweeping away the thickest layers of dust. It was becoming less of a tomb and more of a workshop. I went back to the tack room and opened the footlocker again. I pulled out the photo albums. Sitting on the floor, I opened the first one. There, they were, the ghosts from my past, smiling in faded color. My mother as a little girl, riding the rocking horse I'd found in the empty bedroom. My grandfather, younger, stronger, his arm around her, a rare, wide smile on his face. And then, pictures of me, a baby in my mother's arms, a toddler taking my first steps on the farmhouse porch. There were pictures of my father, too, handsome and smiling, and for a moment I felt a pang of sadness for the man he could have been. Flipping through the pages, I was watching a life I had lived but couldn't remember. I saw birthday parties, Christmases, lazy summer afternoons by the creek. In every photo, my grandfather was there, a steady, quiet presence in the background. Seeing this visual record of their love, of our family, didn't erase the pain of the years I'd spent alone, but it reframed it. The emptiness of my past was an illusion. It hadn't been empty at all. It had been full of a love so fierce and protective that it had been willing to become invisible to keep me safe. Home. I had spent my life thinking it was a place, a building with 4 walls and a roof. I'd yearned for it in every foster house, every group home. But sitting there, on the floor of that old barn, I realized my mistake. Home wasn't a place you were given. It was a place you fought for. It was a place you built. Not just with wood and nails, but with choices, with sacrifice, with love. My grandfather hadn't left me a rundown ranch. He had left me a foundation. The house was just a house. The land was just land. But the choice he had given me, the choice to stay, to fight, to honor his memory, to build something real, that was the true inheritance. He hadn't left me a destination. He had left me a direction. The scars of my childhood, the feeling of being unwanted, the deep-seated fear of abandonment, they were still there. They probably always would be. But they no longer felt like the whole story. They were just a part of it now, one chapter in a much longer, more complicated book. And the best part was, the final pages were still unwritten, and I was the one holding the pen. The loneliness I had carried for so long was finally starting to dissipate, replaced by a quiet sense of purpose that felt as solid and real as the land beneath my feet. The sun began to set, casting long, golden shafts of light through the gaps in the barn walls. I closed the photo album and stood up. I walked to the massive barn doors and slid one open, looking out at the valley. The fields of wild grass swayed in the evening breeze. The creek shimmered in the distance. The old farmhouse stood silhouetted against the vibrant, painted sky. It wasn't perfect. It was scarred and weathered and in need of 1,000 repairs. A lot like me, but it was mine. And for the first time in my life, I knew exactly where I belonged. It's been a year since that day. The legal fight with Mountain View Estates is still ongoing, a slow, grinding, battle of paperwork and depositions. But we're winning. The state has opened a formal investigation into their business practices, thanks to the meticulous records my grandfather kept. Mr. Finch thinks they'll eventually cut their losses and disappear. The victory won't be a sudden dramatic courtroom scene, but a quiet, hard-won peace. The ranch is slowly coming back to life. I've repaired the porch, painted the house, and planted a new garden in the same spot my grandfather once did. Gus, the mechanic, helped me get the old tractor running, and I've started clearing the fields. Martha, from the general store, brings me a pie every now and then, and I've shared a few beers with some of the other ranchers in the valley. They've accepted me. I'm no longer the strange kid from the city. I'm just Leo, Thomas Vance's grandson. It's not a fairy tale ending. There are days when the loneliness creeps back in, a phantom limb aching for a past I can only see in photographs. There are nights when the weight of it all, the responsibility, feels like it's going to crush me. The work is hard, and the money is tight. The scars from my past haven't vanished, but they don't define me anymore. They are a part of my story, a reminder of where I came from, but not a map of where I have to go. This place, this land, it taught me that inheritance isn't about what you're given in a will. It's about what you choose to accept, what you choose to fight for. It's about the legacy of love and sacrifice that can be hidden in the most broken down, forgotten places. My grandfather gave me more than a ranch. He gave me a second chance. He gave me a history. And he gave me the opportunity to build a future with my own two hands. If you've ever had to fight for your own second chance, or if you're in the middle of that fight right now, I want you to know you're not alone. The stories we are told about ourselves, about where we come from and what we are worth, are powerful. But they aren't always the truth. Sometimes the most important thing we can ever do is find the courage to pick up the pen and write a new chapter for ourselves, one that honors the past but isn't imprisoned by it. Thank you for listening to my story. If it meant something to you, if it stirred something in you, oh, what have you had to fight for? What forgotten places in your own life held an unexpected truth? Let's make this a space where those stories are heard and honored. This community is built on the idea that our pasts don't have to be our prisons. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, please consider subscribing. We're building something here, together, one story at a time. Thanks for being